All right, Sue, attendees are trickling in. We might give them just a couple of seconds more and then get started.
Certainly. It's good to see everybody coming in. We're looking forward to a great hour and some change typically, because we never quit on time. And great conversations with Dr. Beth Carey today. So welcome, come on in, settle in, start thinking about questions you may have, and we'll take those, of course, in the chat like we always do. And also on Twitter, if you want to tweet those out at #UDLIRN.
Alrighty, I think we're ready.
All right. Well, once again, welcome everybody. We are delighted this evening to be joined. Evening here may not be evening for you. We're delighted to be joined by Dr. Beth Carey. Brian Dean is here to host tonight, and so he'll be introducing her in just a moment. But I wanted you to have access to her Twitter account in case you would like to include her in your tweets tonight or reach out to her following tonight's broadcast. And it is at Equitable Access, and at Kennedy Krieger is her place of employment. So joining us tonight is our host, Brian Dean from the UDL IRN and CAST, and he'll be not interviewing, that's the wrong word. He'll be having a conversation with Lisa, and we'll have an opportunity to listen in. And also joining us tonight is our IRN PL committee. We'll kind of be working the back end of things, taking in your questions. So put those in the chat tonight. If you're watching on live YouTube, go ahead and tweet those out to us, and we'll be passing those on to Brian and to Beth as the evening wears on. Here's that hashtag in case you need it. It's #UDLIRN. And with that, I'm going to just close up our slide deck and give it over to Brian and Lisa to go ahead and get us started.
Very cool. Thank you very much, Sue. I have to tell you, I'm pretty excited to kind of come out of retirement and be able to talk with not only somebody who I've known in the field for a bit, but somebody I consider pretty good friends. So it's actually a really big honor. I remember the first time that we met. Do you remember the first time we met, Lisa?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. We met at the first summit. Yeah, and I had just given some wacky talk, and I was probably wearing some stupid hat or something. But then like you came up and you had all these brilliant ideas, and I was like, I need a minute to process because there was so much brilliance in the air. It was like electricity. So it was very cool. And then from there, it's just been this really cool ride to watch you. To watch your work and to talk with you before. I mean, how many presentations have you given at the summit, do you think? Every year, though. Well, at least every year.
Yeah, except for the year my son was born. Yeah.
Well, I mean, we lost out on that one.
I thought I could present that one. I actually still applied and was sent my stuff in, and everyone was like, "That's a month after," and I was like, "I'll be fine." And then
you'll be fine. Yeah.
And then I was like, "No, that was a terrible idea."
Yeah. Why am I not surprised by that? Why am I not at all surprised that you thought that I'll be good? I'll be up there. It won't be any big deal. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It was very mistaken.
Yeah. Well, so but every one of them since then, and to be honest, they've all been bangers. Like they've all been really great talks that you've given. I'm gonna let everybody in on this. I've been privy to some of those talks before they even kind of came to full fruition, and I've always been like, geez, this is a fantastic idea, or what an interesting take, or just what a different thought around something that has been kind of in the UDL, zeitgeist or the UDL community for so long, but here we are talking about it in a different way. So with that, I'm just super, I'm stoked as always to sit and chat with you about kind of what's going on and what you're doing and what you're up to right now and all that sort of stuff. And we'll dive into that. But first, can you tell us, can you can you tell us where you're like what you're doing, where your work is, for people that don't know?
Yeah, sure. So I get ready for a really long job title.
See, this is why I did it. This is why I did it because look, y'all, I'm gonna tell you, I'm just gonna come clean with it, be transparent. Before we got on, I'm like, so what is the title now? And I was like, okay, well, I'm gonna have to find a way after she gave me the title. I'm gonna have to find a way to have her say it instead. So please tell us what you're doing, where you're at, what your title is.
I'm the Assistant Director of the Center for Innovation, Leadership, and Special Education at the Kennedy Krieger Institute.
I'm going to need it one more time.
A lot of breath control to get
I'm going to need it one more time.
And I'm also an assistant research scientist at the Johns Hopkins School of Education. So Kennedy Krieger is an affiliate of Johns Hopkins. It is primarily a children's hospital. It's with a focus on rehabilitation and disorders of the brain and spine. So we have a lot of like cross action going on with Hopkins and all of the different schools. And we sit on like the medical campus of Hopkins is intertwined with the Kennedy Krieger buildings too. So it's all like the same spot in Baltimore. So that job title doesn't really describe what I do.
They rarely do, though. You know what I mean? Like they rarely seem to kind of describe what the nitty gritty of the everyday is. So if you could lay that on us, I would love it.
Yeah. So I kind of like to think about it as sitting kind of like on a bridge in between pediatric medicine and K-12 education. So all of the kids that Kennedy Krieger sees are students, right? And they all typically need instructional supports that are different than what like very traditional schooling entails, right? So some of the kids do get special education related services. Some of the kids have 504 plans. Some of them just need someone to take a unique look at their learning environments, right? And that's where UDL kind of comes in. So I assist our clinicians primarily in the neuropsychology department in helping guide patients and their families through the educational process. And then I also train teachers and schools and school districts about neurodevelopmental disabilities.
So I don't want to interrupt the flow, but there's something really interesting here, like at least to me, because it's not just one level of approach, right? It's not just you're bridging the gap or sitting in this place that is in between, the medical side of these students' treatment, but and then the educational side, but you're also acting as kind of like this bridge between through the educational process to parents and students, and then also training teachers and what chronic illness looks like and what that and how we need to address that. Is that would that be safe? That's a pretty massive job, Lisa. That's not just gloss over. That's huge. That's really massive.
So in order to prepare, so I was a special education teacher in 2 different school districts in Maryland. And then I went to Kennedy Krieger and Johns Hopkins for a 1-year fellowship to learn about developmental neuroscience and do interdisciplinary training with our clinicians and researchers. And then I never left. They couldn't get rid of me.
Right.
So that's kind of like what prepared me, but I've also been, through like that. So that was in 2013 that I did that fellowship, and I stayed on and have had just like phenomenal mentors along the way, and just have really been fortunate to work with a lot of people who are interested in interdisciplinary work. So I work with doctors and clinicians and researchers who want to communicate with educators. And so that really helps. And then there's a lot of educators clearly who are interested in neuroscience and how things work. And honestly, like UDL fits in there so well. I actually every year train our neuropsych clinicians and neuropsych postdoc trainees about UDL. So actually they use the UDL guidelines to write neuropsych recommendations frequently, because it's a good communication bridge between the assessments they're doing and just explaining what supporting those in the learning environment might look like.
So I mean, this is next level learner centered to me. in many ways, right? Because it steps beyond. So there just have to be some very unique challenges and barriers that kind of exist in this space, right? Like in this place of, young individuals that have some kind of chronic illness or or need some kind of medical treatment, ongoing treatment, and their work within the school. Like, how does that play out?
So I started a hospital liaison program. So we call it the Hospital Education Liaison Program, or HELP.
Yeah.
And
It's got to be an acronym. I mean, you're working in medicine and school, so you got to figure out an acronym.
Yes,
sure.
yes, it's all the acronyms. There's so many acronyms in my life; it's incredible.
Right.
But the focus of that is to support kids who have chronic and complex medical conditions that also have a neurocognitive impact. So I primarily work with oncology patients who are seen at Hopkins, so pediatric oncology, childhood cancers. And then they're also followed in neuropsychology. The head of the neuropsychology oncology clinic is Dr. Lisa Jacobson, who's been featured on Louis Lord Nelson's UDL and research podcasts and has done stuff for the UDL IRN before. But she is a neuropsychologist whose expertise is in how cancer and cancer treatment impacts the developing brain. And since she has been my mentor since I was a fellow, and I myself am a cancer survivor, I got really interested in that work and wound up trying to figure out how we could do better hospital liaison work for that patient population. So I go to clinical rounds, which is a weird thing for a teacher to be doing. And I still consider myself like primarily in teacher mode all the time. But so once a week, I go to our rounds, I learn about our patients. I follow up with the clinicians after they're done doing all of their assessments and they've given feedback to the families. And then we call a warm handoff, where they introduce me to the family, and then we discuss the case and how I can support. All of this is free to families because the Children's Cancer Foundation has given us a grant to trial this program. And then I attend school meetings, meet with school staff, give school staff resources, answer their questions, make sure everyone's on the same page, and at the same time, make sure that the medical team understands schooling, like that you can't write a prescription for an IEP, or just kind of like explaining that you don't necessarily even need special education because we can actually be flexible in how instruction works. Sometimes some students still need special education. I am in no way saying that UDL replaces special ed, but there are cases where like the understanding of what schooling is like in the 21st century is not known to people outside of education. And so just kind of explaining those dynamics. And then I expanded the program to work with our sickle cell patients as well.
Can you speak a little bit more about that? Like we had been kind of talking about that before.
Yeah.
I think it's.
Sorry to cut you off.
No, go ahead. No.
So that's a patient population. A lot of people don't know that sickle cell disease actually can impact the developing brain. It can also cause, because of strokes and other cardiac incidents, that it can cause damage to the brain. So not just so it's developmental or there's like a hit. And then because of frequent illnesses, pain crises, all this other stuff going on, kids miss a lot of school. They're tired, they're in pain, they're having trouble concentrating. A lot of kids have difficulty with executive function, secondary to their illness. So a lot of the work it's a lot of the same stuff that I do for the oncology clinic, but I work with an interdisciplinary team at Kenny Krieger and Hopkins, and follow the patients, meet the patients, work with their parents to understand schooling processes, and like work with the schools to make sure everyone's on the same page.
So I am just like I'm still trying to process everything that you're kind of like laying out, because it's really it's quite a bit, right? And at the center of that, it's nice that it's framed in this sense of this of UDL. But I guess another question that just kind of pops into my mind is, how does the medical field kind of take up UDL? Like, what does that look like when you're working with them?
So I think I think the different fields have different impressions of it. So with neuropsychology, they're the neuroscience bridge between like neuroscience and then like things that we can actually use in the classroom. And so they're kind of like, in terms of thinking about UDL, there are definitely our early adopters in terms of like the medical world, right? Like they're like, oh, this makes sense to us. Like this is what we want this to be able to communicate. A tool that actually describes executive function is very exciting to them, right? So they have always reacted very well, and like, you know, like I said, included in their recommendations. Many of the psychologists I work with have gone to conferences to present to other psychologists about it. So it's definitely something that they are very interested in. Our behavior psychology friends also, because they're like, oh, set up the learning environment so it meets everyone's needs. That sounds a lot like antecedent controls. Yay.
Right. Right.
I think it's a little bit more removed from the other medical practitioners. Sometimes clearly we have, you know, speech pathologists, occupational therapists, physical therapists, the idea of like everyone should be able to do things the way that works for them is like in their wheelhouse too.
Yeah.
And so I think that for a lot of the fields that I work with, it all just kind of clicks for them. I think that some of the, like, I haven't really done too much in terms of like the like pediatricians, like teaching them about UDL, because it's just not, I don't work with them as closely. But it's certainly something that we are expanding, because shout out to Eric Moore. I convinced him to join Kennedy Krieger, and now he's running our new program for digital technology and learning design. So he is going bit by bit. He transferred from teaching higher ed folks about UDL to teaching doctors about UDL. So we are starting a medical UDL revolution over at Kennedy Krieger Institute.
Yeah, that's the part that I find really amazing. And, you know, as we enter into this, and you've always kind of been on the front end of this as well, but as we've redefined what variability is, both what it means socially and what it means with, you know, culturally and all these different areas, I think also we need to start defining what variability looks like in different fields of study. And so, like you sit right on the front end of that, you know, I've got to ask about the parent side as well. And how are you helping them understand universal design, or
yeah,
what's that look like?
That's definitely one of the things we talk about. So a lot of the patients' families that I work with, you know, their kids have a chronic and complex illness, but they're also dealing with a lot of, in the medical world, you'd call them social determinants of health, but basically it's like all of the things in life that make it harder. And education is definitely, you know, the same barriers exist in terms of getting a quality and equitable education. So having financial difficulties, poverty, living in low income areas, systemic racism, like all those things come into play. And so a lot of times it's very overwhelming thinking about, you know, how can I just get my kid through? And I just need to do it the way everyone else is doing, right? Like, so we just need to, and so kind of talking about variability and that there's lots of ways to get things done, I've noticed like takes kind of a weight off the shoulders of a lot of parents, that this idea that like there isn't one right way of doing things, and that learning can happen in a lot of different ways. And there's a lot of variability in who we are and how we learn and how we enjoy learning. And I think that kind of helps people reconceptualize their worries about their kids and how they're going to do in school and what kinds of pressures they should be putting on themselves and their families.
Yeah, I would imagine so, because I think that's it. We've you know, as parents, we fall into this kind of traditional role of like, this is what school was like before. And like you said, they have so much that's actually really, you know, going on besides, you know, am I turning in assignments on time, that, you know, there's just, I can imagine the immense stress that produces for the parents. But then to understand that there's a bunch of different ways to get through your journey, right? Like there's a bunch of different pathways, and it's not really a race against others, right? That's not how it works. It's really about how do we find, and I love that phrasing that you said, like, how do I find my learning joy, right? Like the stuff that I want, like I want to learn, how do I find the best way for myself to learn? And then how do I, as a parent, how do I advocate for my kid to get there? So I have to ask you, because this is this really cool place in your UDL journey, but I got to ask where it started. Like, where did you begin? And now you end up here. You've given us a little kind of like a little preview of that, but I'd love to hear from the beginning.
So I was a special education teacher in Baltimore County Public Schools, and I was part of a co-teaching project where we got a lot of extra training and support. And then I became one half of a co-teaching team that was a model classroom. So people from the district and outside of the district would come bring people in to watch me co-teach. And I was co-teaching in social studies classes, and the head of like special ed and social studies for Baltimore County was Liz Berquist. So she came into my classroom and was watching and was like, who took me aside and was like, who taught you guys about UDL? And we were like, I don't know what you're talking about. She's like, well, it looks like you're trying to do some UDL here. And I was like, oh no, this is differentiation. She was like, but you made an option for everybody. I was like, yeah, because every time I gave out a thing that was specially designed for someone else would ask for it. And I didn't want to keep giving it out. So I just left it on the side. And she was like, okay, yeah, I think you're getting it. So I then went to a special summer institute for anyone teaching American government in the state. And the person running it, again, was Liz Berquist. She spent the summer teaching us how to teach American government using UDL. UDL just clicked for me. It was like, this makes sense. This is how things should go. I kept investigating it. And then I moved to St. Mary's County Public Schools in Southern Maryland, and wound up with two colleagues who, Marissa Kincaid and Bridget Dunbar, who were also very interested in UDL. And we just kind of started talking about it and bringing it into our practice more. I also had several amazing students that helped me just click for me. And parents too, who were just really invested in trying to get UDL type stuff going. And then when I went to the fellowship, when I got there, they said, we want you to be able to work on some projects too, like to implement the stuff you're learning here. What are you interested in? And I said, I'm really interested in UDL and middle school. And they said, oh, that's great. There's someone at Towson University who's doing a project with that in Baltimore County. Her name is Liz Berquist. Do you know her? I was like, yes, stalking Liz continues. So basically my UDL journey is just me following Liz Berquist around. So I highly recommend that all of you do the same and follow her on Twitter. But that was like pretty much where it got off the ground for me. And then Liz is who brought me to the first UDL IRN, which is where we met, and continued to introduce me to other people in the field, and just kind of blossomed from there.
It is interesting, because every time I ask that kind of question, it is always there's always another person within the community, and it's a person that is actually somebody that is really accessible. Like if you ever enter into, if you ever go to a summit, or you ever go to a symposium, or really kind of any event that Liz is at, you can pull Liz aside and you can chat with her, and she would love to chat with you. And you could pull just a whole host of people. Just everybody in our community is pretty open. And that's kind of how it all starts, right? Like it all starts with that one person, and then it builds, and then there are probably people that you have reached out to, and they're like, well, I just keep kind of meeting Lisa, Lisa Beth Carey, and she's phenomenal, so and that's what kind of moved my journey along. But there's always also this thing that happens, like everybody always has this phrase of like, it just clicked. And while I love that, and that's what I experienced as well, I'm wondering, like, what is it that clicked? What was the biggest pieces that clicked? I mean, beyond the all is all,
so,
you know what I mean?
So definitely the idea that not everyone needs the same thing at the same time made total sense to me. The idea that like being really flexible shouldn't just be the purview of special education also made a lot of sense to me. I think just because personally, so I have dyslexia, but I didn't qualify for special education. So I was always just kind of like hobbling together my own stuff with my parents. And throughout college and grad school, have always just like had to create flexible ways of getting things done and doing things my own way. And so that made sense to me on a very personal level. And then my students really, just like I said, I had been trained in differentiated instruction. I thought I was following the thing, like you make a separate thing for these kids and you tell them what they get. But then the other kids kept being like, that's a really cool graphic organizer. Can I have it? I was like, yeah. So they were telling me I need more than how that model works. And I think that the biggest aha moments have been when my students told me what they need. And it was just like, yes, that makes sense. I get it. So a lot of it was definitely, I think my personal experiences, but then also like my professional experiences and learning from my students.
And so then when working with teachers, what about, maybe you don't have those teachers that just doesn't like click for them, or they don't just kind of fall into it. Like, but if you face those challenges, how do you overcome that? What do you kind of do to bring them on board?
Witchcraft.
Okay. All right. Done then. Done.
I'm sure that there's people that have still not gotten on board and are like, Lisa is full of it. And what is this? But I am always willing to have a conversation to say like, well, what about this doesn't work for you?
Mm-hmm.
Let's unpack what's not working. A lot of times it's not the concept, it's the reality of classrooms where there's a lot of top-down mandates. Mm-hmm. So whenever I get a lot of pushback, it usually winds up being like, look, I have to follow my curriculum guide. I have to pretty much read a script. I have to give tests, and all of my assessments are made for us. We have to do it this way. And I've interestingly been brought into schools to train people in UDL where that's, the school's reality, and the school leadership is just like, well, yeah, that's how we do things, but just fit this in. So I think a lot of the pushback I've gotten over the years from teachers is more about frustration of, you're telling me how wonderful it could be, but nothing is set up in this context for me to do that. And just the frustration of not being able to even think more flexibly in some scenarios. So I think it's more systems that are causing barriers than individual teachers.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that isn't that interesting, right? Like I've very rarely met any teachers that have said this UDL thing is garbage, right? Like finding a way for all students to kind of access learning and access information is kind of BS. I haven't really run into that, but I have run into exactly what you described. This idea of, I would love to do that, and it sounds like it's a really great thing, but this is what's mandated. I still have to turn in lesson plans every week. I still have to, give this assessment that is developed by the district, and we can't stray away from it. So in that case, those teachers that come to you with some of that frustration, like, do you tell them like, here's one thing to do, or do you tell them how do you approach that?
So it's usually, let's find where you can fit in the flexibility that makes sense. And then a lot of times it's, as an outsider, it's easier for me to go to the school leadership and say, here are the barriers that are set up for being able to implement this. Where's the flexibility that you can create? And telling the teachers that I'm going to do that. Not saying like, well, so-and-so told me, but saying like, are you comfortable with me talking to your school leadership about this? They asked me to come here to talk to you and let's figure out what we can do about this. And usually when it's like, I hear what you're saying, I understand what it's like to be in that position. And as an outsider, I'm going to leverage my outsiderness and go complain on your behalf, essentially. I think that sometimes helps too, to just feel like, all right, I have an ally in trying to do this work.
Well, I think that it speaks to the issue that you had talked about before, right? Usually, so, a major part of our problems kind of fall within systems, and it's not really within the teacher. And it's interesting that when we look at, especially our K-12 educational system, that our stakeholders, the two major stakeholders, students and teachers, have very little voice in what happens, right? They have a lot of it's mandated to them, but they have very little voice and choice in doing what they've been trained to do, and taught to do, and practicing their craft. So I think that's a massive piece that you're not just an ally, you're this huge advocate that says, here's the efficacy of this, and I'll fight for you. And I think that, especially right now in education, that's what's needed, and it's commendable. I do have a question though that just came in, and it's going to switch gears just a little bit, if that's all right. But the question is, what do you see on the horizon for UDL, especially in the context of neuroscience? Yeah.
Whoa. So I know that there's a lot of things going on with the UDL guidelines right now, with it being redesigned and a little bit, and adding things in. I think that in terms of neuroscience, I think one of the key things to know about is that not everything that is discovered in neuroscience translates into what we do, right? Like, it's not, finding out that a certain cell structure in the brain is set up one way is not going to like immediately translate into us doing something differently. And if you ever read an article saying that you should, then it's like suspicious, right? That like the bench science, like people with test tubes, they're not finding things that directly relate to what we do. So I think like the research that's more in the field of mind, brain, and education research, neuropsychology, those fields, I think what we're learning a lot about is the importance of emotion, which is already a big part of UDL, but just how much. Like, I think we've focused a lot on reducing threats. Like, we've focused on the negative. I think like, let's help people not be stressed. Let's help people. But we didn't go to the other side, which is joy, which I mentioned earlier, but mentioned purposefully, because it's not just that when you're upset and stressed, you have trouble learning. It's that you learned so well when you're joyful. And that I think like, I would love to see UDL to focus on that too. Like, how do we build not just non-threatening classrooms, but joyful classrooms, joyful learning environments? How do we ignite joy in our learners through choice, through all the different things that UDL does? But how do we emphasize that part too? And not just focus on the reductions of threats, which is really important. And I want us to keep that part, but, also think about the other side of that, which is that we want, a learner who's a lifelong learner, is a joyful learner.
Yeah. So what does that look like then in a classroom? Not even a classroom of today, because we'll get to that, but what does that begin to look like just in the classrooms that we used to do?
So I think that one of the coolest schools that I've ever gotten to work with is City Neighbors Charter School in Baltimore City. So shout out to my friends, City Neighbors. But their philosophy, so they are a public charter school, and in Maryland, charter schools are a little different than other places in the country. So if I'm not trying to get into a charter public school debate right now, but there's a lot of rules, and they're run by our city's like schools. So it's not the same kind of setup as other places. But they are a project-based and arts integrated school. And I came in to teach them about UDL. And it's so easy to teach UDL to a bunch of people who do arts integration and project-based learning, because it just clicked so well.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. They resonate with it for sure.
Yeah. And a lot of some of the teachers actually, like, they went to the CAST symposium and some other places and just were like, here's how you do project-based learning. And if you're really into UDL, here's why it works so well. And here's how arts integration is really, really key to that emotional component. And I have, the school had, the reason they asked me to come in was that 40% of their students had disabilities when at the point where they asked me to come. And they had huge ranges in like things like reading levels and like, there's like tons of variability in terms of demographics, but also just like, the nitty gritty academic things that we, and the classes still had this like hum to them. Like they were happy places where like you'd come in, they were like, let me show you my project, like that kind of stuff. And the projects were all different. They'd be like investigating some topic, but the kids just kind of like went with what they were interested in it. And they worked so much harder than students in more traditional settings or more traditional pathways because it was their project, it was their passion. And the arts integration piece like just gave them even more flexibility. They would have these showcases and it was just amazing. Like this, I think one of my favorite things I ever saw was that the second graders created a reptile museum where each kid had a different area. They turned their classroom into a museum, and then they had their exhibits were made. They like in different art forms created the reptiles, and they created all the aspects of it. They made brochures, they sold tickets. They invited me, everyone in, and then you got tours of the reptile museum, and it was just incredible.
Yeah, that museum idea is such a fantastic, and it doesn't matter if it's been done before. Like it's just however it becomes interpreted, and however students see that and they want to build upon that. Like what you're really talking about is they're building into their passion, right? Like it's passion driven education as much as it's project based education. It's passion driven education. Mm-hmm. So so you talked a little bit about that UDL is the guidelines are kind of going through this reworking, and so I guess that's my next question. Like, what do you see as that reworking? What do you see as the next levels of UDL, or where UDL sits in 5 years, 10 years? What's your vision?
Well, I love the direction that things seem to be going in terms of addressing systemic forms of oppression. So I feel like that's a really big positive of us, as we talked about, like the systemic barriers. There's so many systemic barriers. So I think addressing and acknowledging that is really important. I do have a passion for executive function, and so I would like to have us rewrite the executive function section so that it includes executive functions that are really critical, especially for younger learners, like inhibitory control. Shout out to inhibitory control being in the UDL guidelines. That was my nerd dance. So I would like to see that, and I would love if we could like help. I don't know how, you're the visual expert, but like a visual to help everyone understand that like executive function and self-regulation are like buddies that like work together. There's a lot of stuff in the framework that like, they're on the same level and they're there for a reason, but it needs to be clearer. Like,
connections drawn. Yeah, for sure. And that there's a relationship there that is not just like one and then the other, or that they support each other. Absolutely. Yeah. So what else, right? Because you were involved in higher ed as well. So where do you see UDL in higher ed?
So clearly everyone in higher ed should be using UDL guidelines. It's a given. I feel like that's been said already. I want us to teach all of the students at all ages about UDL. That's another one. I want us to reach out more to parents and talk to them about UDL. And then, obviously I'm all about teaching particularly our pediatric medical folks about UDL, and not just for purposes of talking to schools, but for thinking just about like all the information that we give people. I frequently complain to my own doctors when they give me something that I feel is inaccessible for different reasons. But just making sure that spaces in which we're trying to share information and encourage learning are designed using the best design principles that we have, right? So medical places are places that we're trying to teach people things. Like, we're not just treating people, we're saying, here's what you need to know about your body, your health. Here's what you need to be doing on your own. Here are changes you might need to make. Here are things to avoid. Here's things to do. And if that instruction is all coming in a pamphlet and that's it, that's not okay. So thinking about how we do instruction in all realms of our lives.
Well, and I would think that that's especially highlighted with chronic illness, right? Or chronic pain, or, because even if it's not something like cancer, but it's something like diabetes, right? That's going to be around for you. Like, that's a lifelong thing now that you have to handle, you have to learn about. But many times the stuff that you get as a patient is a pamphlet, or, come in for this class, right? And it's a lecture class and they tell you that's it. But that doesn't stay with me. That doesn't resonate with me. I don't synthesize that information. And then I come in and I'm sick again, or I'm sicker, or I need more help. So I think it's really interesting. It's really interesting. I wonder though, so now we're going to switch to another. So we've covered what we think about as far as like where the guidelines are going. Think about higher ed, we think about other fields, but you say that you work with parents. And so what's the number one thing to kind of get parents involved?
Yeah.
Or a couple things.
Well, I think first of all, parents are really incredible advocates for educational change. Policies that are made regarding education tend to come from what politicians feel like the parents want a lot of times. Like, not always the case, but just kind of like, what are my constituents looking for? Not necessarily what are the teachers saying. So I think like helping parents to understand the benefits of UDL so that they can advocate for it is huge. And then also just understanding it, because so many parents, especially now, but so many parents are trying to do instruction at home. And what can that look like, and what should that look like? I think if parents don't know about UDL, they try and do things in that rigid way, and then that can be really frustrating to both their kids and themselves. So helping them understand, like, there's lots of ways that we can be doing this. And then I think also like coupling UDL with an anti-ableism approach. So, also thinking about that like having flexibility isn't just about like, it's nice to have options, but that it's honoring the fact that we are all different, and that there isn't this just like one perfect way to do things, that there's nothing inherently better or worse in reaching a goal through different modalities.
Well, it seems like, you kind of said it before, you kind of stated it before. It's not that, there's this one way, and this is the perfect kind of way, and you're out of true, right? Like, you're not in alignment with that. So we're going to use something like UDL to bring you back into what we consider normalcy, or what we consider true. But instead, here's a systemic or a system-wide approach to kind of embracing the things that kind of make you up, right? Like, we talk about the jagged learning profile and talk about the margins and all those things, but really, it's really like, these are the things that make you up, and they're the things that are honest about you, right? Authentic about you, and turn your education into something that's authentic. I think that's, to me, that's this really great idea. And I love the way that you phrase it, to be honest, because it never feels like you're talking about educators, or talking about students, or talking about parents being at the kind of the center of this issue, right? But it's really that it's system issues. Right. So it kind of drops that defensiveness and says, we need to handle some systems, and these systems are inequitable and they're archaic, and these are ways that you can help move that. I think that's a really great approach. So
I think you're making me sound smart, so that's good.
No, I don't make you sound smart. You just are, right? So yeah, and I think that like there's this, and Sue gave this comment in the chat, but it is this idea of giving parents and students and educators and medical individuals, everybody, giving them permission to do school in other ways, right?
Mhm.
Because we're still like, that system is a monster. It's a behemoth. We know it is, but being able to do school and have the permission to see what's great about that is one of the big change factors. So I think it's a great one. So if I were to ask you, it's another question that came up, but what's the best executive functioning hack that an educator could kind of put into place? I know it's very broad. That's a
Whew.
very,
Yeah.
it's huge. But if you had one or a couple.
I think that the number one thing to think about is that stressed, tired, anxious, depressed, angry kids, all of that stuff, that all throws your executive function skills out of whack. So even if you had pretty good executive function skills, all of those things, like any of those things happening, throws you off. So I would say that like helping kids first emotionally, and then doing, and then also like giving lots of supports, even if you think they might not need them, like being able to back off. Trying to think, like, I think the number one mistake that we make is assuming that impulsive behavior is either careless or purposeful. And it's actually just a sign that the executive function needs more support. So I think like, again, that inhibitory control piece, just like really supporting that. Because if you can support that, then everything else, it's the base of that pyramid, right? Inhibitory control is the number one thing.
Yeah, I think that's brilliant, and I wish that more teachers had that. I will tell you, I know that it might come as a surprise, but I have a touch of ADHD, and I always have, and it wasn't diagnosed until I was an adult. I was just a troublemaker, right? Like I always say, I was a deviant long before I was a positive deviant, right? But it really, what it was is I just didn't have that control, and people thought that it was me trying to act out for either attention, or it was me trying to act out because I was bored, but it really wasn't. It's really just really hard to sit and have you kind of try and drill information into my brain, And so I think that's a message that I think a ton of teachers still need to hear. I think that we are in a much better place than we used to be, but I think it's still something like having, and I can understand it. You have a kindergartner running around, right, acting like it's Lord of the Flies. It's real hard to be like, well, let's take a step back and talk about impulse, right? Because you want to handle it right now. But if you want the longer success, right, the bigger success, you have to look at that. You have to look at that piece and say, how do we work on that? That's really great. That's excellent. So
you point out that like so many kids get this constant message of you're not doing it right, when it's really that your needs aren't supported at a developmentally appropriate place.
Yeah, and then you get labeled, right? Then you get hit with that label, and then that starts its own thing, right? So I was a conduct disorder kid, you know what I mean? And that maybe it was true, I don't know, but you know what I mean? But I think that it was more like it's hard to hold your impulses when you're that young, and you have all this other stuff. It's like a can of soda. If a student's like a can of soda, you you shake it up, and then you hand it to somebody and say, open it. If they don't know how to open it, they don't think about how to open it, it goes everywhere. Right. And I think that emotionally, sometimes our students are like that. We have to step back and say, how do I handle it? How do I open up this shaken, soda? So I think that, we're kind of coming up on the end, but I do want to give you some room. Are there any side projects that are coming up that you're working on? Anything that you want to push and plug?
So Alexis Reed and I are working on a book about executive function, because as you could tell, I can't just narrow the executive function tips down to one thing. And that's actually part of the reason why Alexis and I are taking so long on this. We can't narrow things down, but we're really hoping to have that out this year. And don't have a title yet, working on that. So
that's excellent.
Yeah, it's been really great being able to collaborate with Alexis Reed on that and work on that. And then I am part of a research lab that's actually people from Kennedy Krieger, Johns Hopkins School of Medicine, Johns Hopkins School of Nursing, and Johns Hopkins School of Education. And our focus is looking at interdisciplinary ways to support childhood cancer survivors with school. So we've had a lot of different projects going on. Right now, I am working on collecting data to look at that high school transition piece. So how do we help kids move from high school into higher ed, jobs, stuff like that. But it's been a really great group to work with. Very supportive of each other, big UDL fans all around. So I'm hoping that in the next year or two, we'll be able to present our findings to the UDL community, because I think UDL has a lot to offer, offering better supports for kids with chronic and complex health conditions like cancer.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it's very, because for any students, right? Any students that are making the transition, it's difficult. And we have seen that our systems are stressed, and that our students now that are making this transition during this time, right? During this specific time in history, not doing very well. But if you add on to that some kind of persistent and chronic illness, and how much they've missed and how uncertain that is, that's even more insurmountable. So I think that's really work to be pushing at. Anything else? What do you got? What else you got going on? You've always got stuff going on. That's why I just leave it as what else you got going on. You always got something going on.
I mentioned that Eric Moore and I are doing a slow UDL takeover. So that's definitely the other exciting stuff that's going on.
That's of digital assets, right? That's digital learning. So what is that like? Just in a few minutes, what is that like? Kind of entering into that world of here's the digital world, and how do we build learning assets from that are UDL?
So a lot of it is training of expert clinicians and researchers to other clinicians. There's this really cool project where it's all about, this is people who were doing telehealth before we had to do telehealth, and just looking at how do we train people in rural areas and give them resource support and stuff like that. So it's this big project with videos and training modules and all that stuff. So some of it's that, some of it's just training a bunch of people who have gone through PhD and medical fields and are still giving PowerPoints where all of the paper is on the thing, and making sure everything's accessible. So, but also teaching people who it's not their job to know learning design necessarily. So kind of being that support. So actually part of my time is spent working directly with Eric on some of those things. He's definitely the leader of that. But just kind of helping people understand digital accessibility when that's not their main role. And helping people to be good science communicators so that they can share their expertise with people like teachers. And it's just been really fun. We actually just built a recording studio. So I'll be heading to the studio soon in order to make videos about education for our sickle cell clinic so that all that information is more accessible. So that actually was a meeting Eric and I had today about how can we make all these videos, how can we make them accessible to patients and their families, so that we're not handing people brochures or just having text on a website. How can we make it more friendly too, so that people who are stressed can actually take the messages in, but also just for accessibility reasons, think about other modalities.
Yeah. Your compassion always comes through, right? Because even in those statements, it's not necessarily their job to understand this, right? That's not what they got into the game for. That's not what they got into their gig for. But we still have to move the mission forward, right? And so I always commend you on it. But your compassion comes through even in that. And I think that's probably the best UDL approach in so many ways, isn't it? Is that we have to have a lot of understanding. We have to say this isn't maybe necessarily what they got into or what they thought it was going to be, but we can help them through the change and we can help them through the process. So I really just love that. And so with that and with that compliment, I want to take some time and I want to thank you. I know we have about 5 minutes left, but we got to pay some bills. So that's going to probably take up some time. But I just want to say that I love listening to you talk. I love hanging out, having a conversation with you. It has been my absolute pleasure to be hanging with you this evening, Lisa. So
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Sue, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Brian. Let me just say that we have probably done 8, maybe 10 network and learn Ask Me Anythings, including one with Brian. But Lisa, I think this has been about my favorite. It was amazing to listen to all that you're doing and your passion and compassion. As Brian pointed out, it's just a fascinating hour. I can't believe it's over already. It was amazing. And I know everybody in the chat will give us a shout out too. It was just wonderful to hear all the work you're doing. And Brian, thank you so much for being our host with the most. We couldn't do these Ask Me Anythings without you. So we appreciate that.
Oh, it's absolutely my pleasure. Absolutely.
All right, I am going to share my screen and finish up. So we just wanted to see, here we go. Make sure that everybody is aware that the IRN Summit and the CAS UDL Symposium tickets, the dual tickets, are available now for the 2022 Symposium and the 2022 Summit. So hop over to either the IRN site or the CAS website, and you can find the link to that. Maybe Mackenzie, if we could put that in the chat in case anyone would like to see that tonight, that would be great.
It's already there.
Awesome. And we'll get that out on Twitter as well. And just a reminder, follow us on Twitter. Lots happening, especially with our Network and Learns, and with the summit approaching. You'll find all kinds of information coming up about the summit on Twitter. So join us, tweet, share. If you're presenting, send out a summation of your presentation, #UDLIRN, let folks know what we should be joining in to see. And then reminder that UDL chat happens the first and third Wednesday of every month. So get online, dial into UDL, #UDL chat, and join in the conversation. And with that, we'll just say thank you to everyone for joining us. And let's see, right here. And we are delighted to have everyone here tonight. And thank you once again, Brian and Lisa, for sharing with us tonight. If you have any final questions and you want to get one last thing in, feel free to put that in the chat.
And don't forget to follow both Lisa, Beth, Carey, and the UDLIRN. You can always, the #UDLIRN is always active. The #UDL chat is always active for all things UDL. So make sure that you hit those up. But Lisa, give us those social media details one more time.
Well, my Twitter handle is @EquitableAccess.
And then one for Kennedy Krieger. Do they?
And it's @Kennedy Krieger.
There you go. Simple enough. And your handle fits so perfectly with your philosophy. So it works really well. So again, thank you so much, everybody, for watching and celebrating